come to order. Without objection, the chair is permitted to declare recess at any time. In April of 2016, as the U.S. presidential race was getting underway, an individual with links to the Russian government reached out to the Trump campaign to telegraph the Kremlin's preference for Mr. Trump. Joseph Massoud, a London-based Maltese professor, told George Papadopoulos, a member of Trump's foreign policy team, that he recently met with high-level Russian officials who told him that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton, including thousands of emails. Papadopoulos was also informed that the Russian government could assist the Trump campaign through the anonymous release of stolen material. At the time Mr. Papadopoulos was given this extraordinary information, the American public was unaware that the DNC and Clinton campaign had even been hacked, let alone that Russia was behind the attack and planned to weaponize the data that it stole. In July of 2016, the Russian government began dumping the stolen emails in precisely the same fashion it had previewed for Mr. Papadopoulos. It was at this point, informed of the Russian outreach to Papadopoulos and aware that the Russians were actively meddling in our election through the anonymous release of the information, that the FBI opened up its investigation. But as James Comey would explain in his first public testimony on the matter in March 2017, and before this committee, the investigation began not as a criminal probe, but as a counterintelligence investigation. What does that mean? How does a counterintelligence investigation differ from a criminal investigation? What does it mean that a U.S. person may be acting as a witting or unwitting agent of a foreign power? And how could the Russians use the compromise of U.S. persons to influence U.S. policy in a manner that jeopardizes our national security? These are the questions that we hope to answer today. During the second of a series of hearings the committee will be conducting to explore the special counsel's disturbing findings in Volume 1 of the report, and to examine what steps are necessary to protect the public, our democracy, and our national security. We will hear from two former senior FBI executives who oversaw the counterintelligence division of the Bureau, who will help us better understand the counterintelligence implications of the range of contacts between the Trump campaign and Russians directly or indirectly tied to Kremlin intelligence services. Volume 1 of the report outlines a sweeping and systemic effort by Russia to interfere in the 2016 election for the benefit of Donald Trump. It establishes that the Trump campaign welcomed the Russian interference because it expected to benefit electorally from information stolen and released through the Russian effort. It shows how the Trump campaign built the theft and dumping of Russian stolen documents into its campaign messaging and strategy. And as special counsel made clear, it sets out in great detail why the conduct in his report should concern every American. The report details well over 100 contacts between the Trump campaign and agents and officials of Russia. Some of this outreach was conducted in public, as when the president called on Russia to hack his opponent's emails, and only hours later, a unit of the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, attempted to do exactly that. Other contacts took place outside of the public view, as in the case of the June 9, 2016 meeting at Trump Tower in New York between a Russian delegation and the president's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., his son-in-law Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign chairman. That meeting was part of a plan to secretly receive help in the form of dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russian government. Still other contacts, because of encrypted apps, destroyed communications, and deception, remain shrouded in secrecy, such as Manafort's meetings with Konstantin Kilimnik, someone the FBI assesses to have ties to Russian intelligence, Manafort's provision of internal polling data to Kilimnik, and their discussion of the campaign strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states. Most Americans consider the solicitation of foreign help during a presidential campaign, the offer of foreign assistance, and the campaign's eagerness to accept that offer, quote, "If it is what you say it is, I love it," to constitute plain evidence of collusion, not to mention the sharing of polling data and campaign strategy by the chairman of a campaign with a foreign nation, which at that very same time is intervening to help their campaign win. Nevertheless, and contrary to the president's oft-repeated mantra and the many misrepresentations of the Attorney General, the special counsel reached no conclusion as to whether the Trump campaign's many Russian contacts constituted collusion, since that term is not defined in criminal law. For those who have not yet read the Mueller report, and most have not, they might be astonished to learn that a finding of no collusion, much less a finding of no obstruction, is nowhere to be seen on any page or in any passage of the Mueller report. Instead, in making its charging decisions, the special counsel examined only whether it could meet the Justice Department's high bar of being able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt at trial each element of the crime of conspiracy, and found that it could not, even as it emphasized that the failure to establish a conspiracy did not mean the absence of evidence of conspiracy. Volume 1 of the Mueller report is therefore, by its very nature and the special counsel's mandate, a report about the exercise of prosecutorial judgment, who should be charged and who should not. It does not contain the FBI's counterintelligence findings, that is, were Trump campaign, transition, or administration figures, including the president, acting as agents of a foreign power wittingly or unwittingly? Were they advancing Russian or other foreign interests by virtue of financial incentives or compromise, whether or not such actions were a crime? These are the types of concerns that the FBI's Counterintelligence Division works to expose, prevent, and investigate using an array of investigative and intelligence capabilities. As we will hear from our witnesses today, the primary objective of a counterintelligence investigation is not to target an individual for prosecution, but to protect the nation by developing information about the actions and intentions of foreign powers and to thwart them before they can act against us. The president's efforts to make money from a real estate project in Moscow and to conceal the transaction from the public are a quintessential example of a counterintelligence nightmare that may or may not include criminal activity. It may not be a crime to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, or for Michael Cohen to seek the Kremlin's help to do so. It may not be a crime to try to enrich yourself with a foreign business deal even while running for president, or to lie about it to the American people. But it is deeply compromising. And not only because of the inducement of hundreds of millions of dollars. No, that is only part of it. It is also deeply compromising because the Russians were on the other end of the transaction and could expose the president's duplicity at any time. In fact, when the Trump Organization's efforts to enlist the Kremlin's help in the deal were finally exposed, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, told the international media that the Kremlin never responded to Michael Cohen's outreach. Thanks to the Mueller report and our own committee's investigation, we now know that Mr. Peskov's statement was a lie. The Kremlin did follow up. So here we have the prospect of the Kremlin participating in a cover-up by the President of the United States. Here is what we know. The President sought to make money from a foreign power during the campaign. So did some of his children. So did his campaign manager and deputy campaign manager. So did his personal lawyer and his national security advisor. Some of these actors have been prosecuted, but all of their actions are deeply compromising of our national security. And yet, Mueller's report provides no evaluation of the counterintelligence concerns raised by these facts and others. Of all the questions that Mueller helped resolve, he left many critical questions unanswered. What happened to the counterintelligence investigation? Were there other forms of compromise like money laundering left out, uninvestigated, or referred to other offices? Were individuals granted security clearances that shouldn't have? And are there individuals still operating in the administration that leave America vulnerable? We are determined to find out. I now yield to the ranking member for any opening remarks that he would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here we are more than 2 years since Democrats from this committee publicly claimed to have more than circumstantial evidence that the Trump campaign colluded with Russians to hack the 2016 election. And more than 2 years since they read false allegations from the Steele dossier into the congressional record at an open hearing of this committee. After that, the American people were subjected to endless hysteria by the media, Democrats, and anonymous intelligence leakers. Seemingly every day, the media triumphantly published a supposed bombshell story, often based on classified documents the reporters had not actually seen. which purportedly proved that President Trump or some Trump associate was a treacherous Russian agent. Democrats on this committee regularly joined the news pundits in denouncing the traitors. Eventually, the Democrats became convinced that the Mueller report would finally rid them of their sinister president who had the audacity to defeat Hillary Clinton. The entire scheme has now imploded, and the collusion accusation has become exposed as a hoax. One would think the Democrats would simply apologize and get back to lawmaking and oversight, but it's clear they couldn't stop this grotesque spectacle even if they wanted to. After years of false accusations and McCarthyite smears, the collusion hoax now defines the Democratic Party. The hoax is what they have in place of a governing philosophy or a constructive vision for our country. The Democrats assembled us today to analyze the shoddy political hit piece known as the Mueller report. It's written in the same spirit and with the same purpose as the Steele dossier, which was once championed by Democrats on this committee, but which they rarely mentioned after it was exposed as yet another Democrat-created hoax. Unfortunately for the Democrats, the Mueller dossier, as I call it, either debunked many of their favorite conspiracy theories or did not even find them worth discussing. These include Mueller's finding that Michael Cohen did not travel to Prague to conspire with the Russians, no evidence that Carter Page conspired with Russians, no mention of Paul Manafort visiting Julian Assange in London, no mention of secret communications between a Trump Tower computer server and Russia's Alpha Bank, and no mention of former NRA lawyer Cleta Mitchell or her supposed knowledge of a scheme to launder Russian money through the NRA for the Trump campaign. Insinuations against Mitchell originated with Fusion GPS chief Glenn Simpson and were first made public in a document published by Democrats on this committee. The real purpose of the Mueller dossier, however, was to help Democrats impeach the president in absence of any evidence of collusion. Thus, the report includes a long litany of ordinary contacts between Trump associates and Russians, as if a certain number of contacts indicate a conspiracy, even if no conversations actually created or even discussed a conspiracy. Excerpts from a voicemail from Trump attorney John Dowd that the Mueller team selectively edited to make it seem threatening and nefarious. No comment on the close relationship between Democrat operatives at Fusion GPS and multiple Russians who participated in the June 9th, 2016 meeting at Trump Tower. In fact, no mention or comment on Fusion GPS at all. No useful information on figures who played key roles in the investigation, such as Joseph Mifsud, a Malta diplomat, or the Australian diplomat Alexander Downer, or the Democrat-paid operative, former spy Christopher Steele. No useful information about the many irregularities that marred the FBI's Russia investigation. Furthermore, the Mueller dossier cites dozens of articles from the reporters and publications that were most responsible for perpetuating the Russian hoax. Thus, Mueller produced a perfect feedback loop. Intelligence leakers spin a false story to the media. The media publishes the story. Mueller cites the story. And the media and the Democrats then fake outrage at Mueller's findings. In sum, Mueller relied on a mass of reporting whose central narrative that the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians to hack the elections is false. And the Democrats spread a hoax claiming Trump is a Russian agent, but it was later discovered the only people who colluded with the Russians were the Democrats, who paid for the Steele dossier, which relied on Russian sources. I'd like to remind the Democrats on this committee that this was created to do important oversight work of our intelligence agencies. This work is even more crucial now that the media have abandoned their traditional watchdog role and instead have become a mouthpiece of a cabal of intelligence leakers. I understand the Democrats' inability to move past their failed hoax and get back to normal business. Nevertheless, I suggest they give it a try. Welcome the speakers today and look forward to your testimony. Yield back.
Thank you to our witnesses for coming before the committee today to ensure that all members are able to ask questions due to competing business of other committees this morning. Today's witnesses will be afforded 5 minutes each for their opening statements, which will be strictly enforced. We will then proceed immediately to member questions. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us for this important open hearing. Stephanie Douglas currently serves as Senior Managing Director of Guidepost Solutions, addressing high-risk investigations and compliance matters. Prior to this position, Ms. Douglas served for over 23 years at the FBI in a variety of roles, including as Executive Assistant Director of the National Security Branch. Robert Anderson is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Cyber Defense Labs and previously was a principal at the Chertoff Group and Managing Director at Navigant Consulting. Mr. Anderson served for many years in the FBI, rising to be the Executive Assistant Director of the Criminal Cyber Response and Services Branch. I'd also like to welcome the minorities witness, Andrew McCarthy, a former Assistant United States Attorney, like many of our staff from the Southern District of New York, and currently a Senior Fellow at the National Review Institute and a contributing editor of the National Review. Ms. Douglas, we'll start with you.
Good morning, Chairman Schiff, Ranking Member Nunez, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to answer questions relative to Volume 1 of the Special Counsel's report regarding Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. As was established and communicated by the U.S. intelligence community in early 2017, the Russian government systematically and effectively used a number of intelligence tools to impact the 2016 election. The Special Counsel's report supports these conclusions and provides specific and detailed examples which illustrate the methods of Russian influence. I'm happy to answer questions regarding this report, but understand that I have no access to any supporting information or investigative detail other than that is provided in the Special Counsel's report. I am proud to have been a special agent in the FBI for almost 24 years, most of it focused on counterintelligence and national security matters. While the FBI has been the subject of much discussion in the press and elsewhere, I support the work of the counterintelligence professionals who worked with the Special Counsels to conduct this exhaustive investigation. I hope that my presence here and our discussion today will lead to further awareness and preparation for what is certain to be another high-threat election in 2020. So with that, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Ranking Member Nunez and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about counterintelligence and cyber threats to our great nation. I hope that my background and experience as the former Assistant Director of Counterintelligence for the FBI, where I was responsible for all counterintelligence, espionage, and economic espionage matters, can assist in shedding some light on the daily threat our country faces from foreign intelligence services. These threats were highlighted several times by the heads of the United States intelligence community and also in the report on the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, which is commonly known now as the Mueller report. In my current role as the CEO of a cybersecurity company, I see hundreds and hundreds of cyber breaches every year. And in my opinion, these attacks originate from a variety of criminal organizations, nation states, and hacktivists. In my opinion, in the last 3 years, these attacks have become more sophisticated, prevalent, and have occurred on a much larger scale than before. I think this is extremely important when we talk about hostile intelligence services and their activities in the 21st century. During my career, I had the privilege to work for 3 directors, Louis Freeh, Robert Mueller, and James Comey. The last position I held, as the chair had said, was the Executive Assistant Director of the Criminal Cyber Response and Services Branch, where I managed a number of divisions, but I was mainly in charge of high-profile criminal and cyber investigations. The threats to our country have changed remarkably since when I first entered into law enforcement in 1987 as a young Delaware State Trooper. During my career, I had the privilege to work alongside the men and women of the FBI and the United States intelligence community, who I can tell you have worked tirelessly to combat these hostile intelligence services activities to our great country. As the committee knows, the number of sophisticated counterintelligence cyber attacks against this nation's networks and private sector companies and government has increased dramatically. I look forward to discussing these issues with you today and the committee, and I stand ready for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Nunes, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here this morning. I served as a federal prosecutor for nearly 20 years, almost all of it at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where I retired in 2003 as the Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney of the Southern District's Satellite Office in White Plains. Since leaving government service, I've been a writer and a commentator. I'm appearing this morning in my personal capacity as a former government official who cares deeply about our national security and the rule of law. For most of my first several years as a prosecutor, my work focused on international organized crime. After the World Trade Center was bombed on February 26, 1993, I spent much of the last decade of my tenure working on national security investigations. I'm proud to have led the successful prosecution of Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman and 11 other jihadists for conspiring to wage a war of urban terrorism against the United States. I was privileged in that effort to work alongside a superb team of federal prosecutors, support staff, and investigators assigned to the FBI's Joint Counterterrorism Task Force. It was in connection with that investigation that I became intimately familiar with the FBI's counterintelligence mission and the powerful tools that the Constitution and federal law make available for the execution of that mission. While it escapes the attention of many Americans who know the Bureau as the nation's premier law enforcement agency, the FBI is also, as my colleagues at the table have noted, our domestic security service. This is a purposeful arrangement on our government's part to have both the national security and the law enforcement mission housed in the same, under the same bureaucratic roof, and I believe it's a prudent one, and that the FBI does it, generally speaking, in an exceptional fashion. I look forward to engaging with the committee. I'd make a few general points to start about Volume 1 of the report. It draws three principal conclusions. First, the Putin regime perceived advantage in a Trump victory and conducted its operations accordingly. Second, there is evidence that the Trump campaign hoped to benefit from the publication of negative information about the opponent. And third, there is no evidence of a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian regime. The first of these two findings are more in the nature of political assertions than prosecutorial findings. If there is insufficient evidence that a conspiratorial enterprise existed, a prosecutor has no business speculating on the motives in a politically provocative manner. Moreover, I do not believe the assertion is borne out by the evidence. The report shows that agents of Putin's regime expressed support for Trump's candidacy. That is entirely consistent with a motivation to incite divisions and dissent in the body politic of free Western nations, which is Russia's MO throughout the world. Russia's goal is to destabilize Western governments, which advantages the Kremlin by making it more difficult for those governments to pursue their interests in the world. Putin tends to back the candidates he believes will lose, on the theory that an alienated losing faction will make it harder for the winning faction to govern. Putin is all about Russia's interests, which is destabilization. It is a mistake, I respectfully submit to the committee, to allow him to divide us by portraying him as on one side or the other side. He's against all of us. There's no reason to doubt that the Trump campaign hoped to benefit from the publication of negative information about Secretary Clinton. That is what campaigns do. It is not an admirable aspect of our electoral politics that campaigns seek negative information, euphemistically known as opposition research, wherever they can find it. Candidate Trump's opposition hoped to benefit from the theft of tax information. The Clinton campaign took help from elements of the Ukrainian government, and through its agents, it hired a British former spy to tap Kremlin-connected operatives for damaging information about Trump. The First Amendment makes it difficult to regulate this sort of thing. Our guiding principle is that good information will always win out against bogus information. We can debate how well that works, but we shouldn't pretend that the Trump campaign is the first or the only one ever to play this game. Finally, as for the conclusion that there was no Trump-Russia conspiracy to commit espionage or violate other federal criminal law, I believe this had to have been obvious no later than the end of 2017. In September of 2017, the Carter Page FISA warrant lapsed. I'm sorry, sir?
Mr. McCarthy, your time has expired, but we'll be happy to receive
Thank you, sir.
the complete written testimony. Thank you. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Douglas, the investigation, as James Comey revealed when he testified before our committee for the first time in open session about the Trump investigation, began as a counterintelligence probe. The Mueller report devotes only one paragraph to that counterintelligence investigation. In it, Mr. Mueller says, from its inception, the office recognized that its investigation could identify foreign intelligence and counterintelligence information relevant to the FBI's broader national security mission. FBI personnel who assisted the office established procedures to identify and convey such information to the FBI. It then talks about counterintelligence FBI agents embedded within Mueller's team sending findings back to headquarters. We have yet to see those findings. Can you tell us the nature of that counterintelligence investigation or a counterintelligence investigation, where those findings would go within the FBI, whether counterintelligence investigations like criminal probes have a formal opening and a formal closing? Since a counterintelligence investigation doesn't result necessarily in criminal charges, when does a counterintelligence probe come to an end, and where do we need to go to find out answers?
Thank you. So I do recall reading that paragraph in the report, and based on the paragraph, it sounds like there are intelligence components sitting within the Mueller investigative team that is reporting other information that may fall outside the purview of the scope of the Mueller investigation. So it could be additional information that they're developing in the course of their investigation that has foreign counterintelligence aspects to it that needs to be looked at independent of the Mueller investigation. So it could be another contact with the Russian that they don't think really falls within the scope of the Mueller investigation, that they then will task out through an intelligence apparatus to an appropriate place, either in a field office or to headquarters, to run down possibly a separate investigation would be spun up on something like that. Counterintelligence investigations do have an opening and a closing, and they're not unlike criminal investigations in a lot of different ways. You have to be able to articulate a predication for an investigation. You have to initially kind of take it through a number of different steps to really affirm the allegation in the first place. And then as you gather information relative to that allegation, you may have an ability to increase the different tools that you use against it based on the amount of evidence, information, and intelligence that you're gathering under that case authority. It could be a preliminary investigation, and I know that you're familiar with some of that there are limited tools that you can deploy against that, or it could be a full investigation, which allows you a much broader set of investigative tools. But there can be beginnings, there are beginnings and ends of these investigations. I hope I explained the intelligence aspect, pushing it back to other components that would actually take the lead and do further work on it outside the scope of the Mueller investigation.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Anderson, the Mueller report focuses really on two things. It focuses on the Russian hacking and dumping operation, and it focuses on the Russian social media operation and the question of whether U.S. persons conspired with either. It does not analyze whether, for example, financial motivations, the president's desire to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, or the campaign chairman Paul Manafort's desire to make money from Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, or the National Security Advisor's effort to make money from Turkey, or other motivations to secure financing for Trump properties, motivated policies towards Russia either during the campaign or thereafter. Would those be in the nature of counterintelligence concerns? And what might concern the FBI about U.S. persons of influence and administration seeking to make money from foreign powers even as they guide U.S. policy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, when it comes to Russia and the SVR, GRU, or FSB, their number one, number two, and number three priority is this country. They will absolutely exploit any avenue that they can when it comes to trying to get to the ends to whatever they're trying to do, whether it's intelligence or it's looking to potentially extort somebody into action. It doesn't surprise me at all that the Russian government launched sophisticated cyber operations against our country during the times when we look at it in the report. They're some of the best in the world at this, quite frankly. They will take that information and exploit it in any way they can. When it comes to the actual individuals that have been approached or talked to in and around the Trump campaign before he became president and even afterwards, it also doesn't surprise me from what I've read in the Mueller report that they are going after, or at least looking to appear to meet with, numerous individuals around and inside the campaign. That is an absolute classic tradecraft of Russia and the Russian intelligence services. They'll never have one point of failure. If they're looking to try to obtain or pass information or potentially even influence information, they'll make sure that they have numerous aspects or points to where they can try to get that done. So to answer your question specifically about that, there are definitely situations where, in some instances, as Stephanie said, you would have concerns about that, and then you would either go out, potentially, depending what they saw, and talk to the individuals that were being approached, or potentially what other information you have, you may then open up either assessments or some type of investigation to look at that. It would definitely be a counterintelligence concern.
And what's the concern when you have policymakers seeking to make money from an adversary at the same time they're making policy?
Well, there's that I think is pretty clear. I mean, you know, in the business world, it's a global business and market. I understand that, but when it comes to national security of the country, there's specific rules regarding all this with our clearances and also what we can and cannot do while we're a government employee. And those rules, as the committee knows, become more intense the higher you go within government. And I think you always have to look at, when you're looking at Russia, there's a so-called president sitting over there that was a former lieutenant colonel in the KGB, one of the most vicious intelligence services in the history of this world, which was disbanded right before he went into politics. He absolutely understands how to run proactive intelligence and counterintelligence operations against our country. So I think that's a high area of threat where people should be very concerned about that.
Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned about anybody in the Department of Justice or the FBI, current or former officials, that would think it's okay to open up a counterintelligence investigation into political campaigns. And I think that's really at the forefront of what we've been facing here. Mr. McCarthy, are you aware of all your 20-plus years at the Justice Department that there was ever a time a counterintelligence investigation opened up on any presidential campaign that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of a specific situation like that. We do have a history in this country of government interference in political campaigns. In fact, the FISA law is a vestige of exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about in the 1960s and 70s. You know, political spying and the notion that we needed to give Americans a modicum of
Well, some degree
process
it was the reason for not only the creation of the FISA laws, but the creation of this committee, was to ensure that the intelligence agencies stayed out of politics. Right. And that was why we provided oversight. And we don't have to get into this too much, but as you know, the Trump team never received a briefing. It seems like at some point they would have went to, if they had concerns about individuals, they would have went to the Trump campaign and explained it to them, especially since they had two former U.S. attorneys on the staff or on the team, and both Governor Christie and former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. I want to get to Joseph Mifsud, because he seems to be the character at the beginning of this saga. He's supposedly the one who was able to see or knew about emails and had talked to Papadopoulos about emails. Now, only go to what Mueller says in his report. He portrays him as having deep ties to Russia, detailing trips to Moscow and extensive contacts with Russian officials. Now, Mueller stopped short of calling Mifsud a Russian agent, Now, James Comey, the former FBI director in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, in fact, does call Mifsud a Russian agent. I'm not sure what he knows that Mueller does not know. However, my big concern about Mifsud is that he was a Malta diplomat. He worked closely with the Italian government. He's described in the press as a Western intelligence asset by some in the press. He worked at the London Center that's affiliated with many operations in the UK. Has been a guest speaker at numerous foreign policy forums all over the globe. I think most concerning to me, two things are most concerning. One is he was known to train or train with FBI officials in Italy. And also that he actually spoke here in the United States Congress, just steps from not this committee, this is the budget committee that we're in, but just a few hundred feet away from the House Intelligence Committee. In 2017, this was after, he knew all of this, supposedly. And yet, that he was invited by our own State Department. So, Mr. McCarthy, my question to you is, if Mifsud truly is what James Comey says is a Russian agent, we have compromises in the U.S. State Department. We have compromises within the FBI, possibly even the Department of Justice.
Well, look, Jim Comey has a lot more information about Mifsud than I do. I've been out of government for a very long time. I do note that the Mueller report is very careful, I thought, about the way that Mifsud is described. They do not, they say that he's got deep connections to Russia. They don't say that he's got deep connections to the Russian regime necessarily, or certainly to Russian intelligence services. I thought it was interesting that we learned in the Mueller report that Mifsud was actually interviewed by the FBI and denied having told Papadopoulos that they discussed emails. The reason I found that interesting is if there's anything we learned from the Mueller investigation, it's that Mr. Mueller was quite good at bringing false statements prosecutions if he thought that he could prove that the witnesses who they were interviewing had given false information to the FBI. No such prosecution was ever brought against Mifsud, so I just thought that was an interesting fact as well.
And also in the Mueller report, in one of the footnotes, they referred to a media story, which I outlined in my opening statement. In that same media report that they used to justify where Mifsud worked, they left out the fact that in that same media story, he was described as a Western intelligence asset. Why didn't that make it into the Mueller report?
You're asking the wrong guy.
It's a little peculiar, I would think. My time is up, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel. The Mueller report highlights the counterintelligence risk posed by financial leverage that the Russians may have had over individuals, a variety of individuals close to President Trump, especially Paul Manafort. The report explains that, quote, Manafort had connections to Russia through his prior work for Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska and later through his work for a pro-Russian regime in Ukraine. Manafort stayed in touch with these contacts during the campaign period through Konstantin Kilimnik, a longtime Manafort employee who previously ran Manafort's office in Kiev and who the FBI assesses to have ties to Russian intelligence. We also know from reporting that Manafort owed Deripaska substantial sums of money. Many of Manafort's contacts with Kremlin-aligned actors took place while he was chairman of Donald Trump's campaign. Among other things, Manafort, quote, instructed Rick Gates, his deputy on the campaign and a longtime employee, to provide Kilimnik with updates on the Trump campaign, including internal polling data. It appears that Manafort believed that by sharing confidential campaign information with Deripaska, one of Putin's most loyal oligarchs, he could resolve their, quote, disagreement originating from several lawsuits filed by Deripaska against Manafort. The ranking member's opening comments that the contacts with Russia were ordinary, notwithstanding, and Mr. McCarthy, with due respect to your many decades of service to this country, that is not what campaigns do. and sharing internal polling data with a hostile foreign power is not what campaigns do. I'm willing to bet you or anybody else my next paycheck that not a single member of the United States Congress, the 535 of us, ever asked our campaign managers to share our internal polling data with a hostile foreign power. So, Mr. Anderson, let me start with you. How could the Kremlin or its intelligence services try to exploit Manafort's longstanding business and personal relationship with Konstantin Kilimnik, who the FBI assesses to have ties to Russian intelligence and to Deripaska? How could they use that relationship? What counterintelligence risks are posed by such a relationship with a presidential campaign?
Well, there's a lot, sir. One, obviously, they would exploit, if they did have financial leverage on that individual, they would exploit every aspect of that. The one thing I will tell you about Russian intelligence services is if you read a book from 1940, they're the same. They are a in-your-face, not a very polite bunch of people that will use any means possible once they've locked on into an individual that they deem necessary to get to whatever end they're going after. So not only would they exploit financial information from Mr. Manafort or anybody else that they could, but they would also use that then to look at individuals around those financial transactions. So in other words, not only going directly at Mr. Manafort, but potentially going at individuals around those financial transactions that if for some reason that did not work against him, they would look at other avenues to get towards that.
Thank you. Ms. Douglas, let me ask you a variant of that question. How could Russia's knowledge of Manafort's illicit dealings, for which he is now a tenant of the United States government, which stem from his work with pro-Kremlin parties in Ukraine, be useful as compromise or compromising material as the Russian government undertook a covert influence effort directed at the U.S. public? How could the Russians use what they knew about Paul Manafort to their advantage?
Well, I think they did it very effectively. And one of the ways they did it that it's immediately apparent is they actually tasked him. And that's one of the initial tests when you are developing an asset for intelligence collection.
Can you elaborate on that? You just said that the Russians tasked the campaign chairman of Donald Trump's campaign. Can you just elaborate on how the Russians tasked him?
They asked him to provide polling data. And like you said, I mean, polling data isn't the keys to the kingdom, right? But it is a small step that illustrates his willingness to provide information to someone he knows he's beholden to financially, right? An ongoing lawsuit, fees that are owed, and he is willing to provide internal campaign information to a foreign government and to a person who was closely tied to the Kremlin. And I think that is a great illustration of how the Russians work. And Paul Manafort was very, very forward-leaning on volunteering all of his abilities, his experience, his connections. He made all that available in addition. But I thought that that was very interesting, that they are tasking him and building upon that. And if he would have stayed with the campaign, I am sure they would have continued to task him.
Thank you. I'm out of time, so I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses. Former FBI Director Comey testified before this committee in open session that the FBI coordinates with the intelligence community as an investigative technique in its investigations. It's since become clear that the U.S. intelligence community expended much time and resources in supporting the FBI's investigation into the Trump campaign for alleged but unfounded collusion with Russia regarding the 2016 election. In December of 2016, nearly a month after the election, President Obama finally ordered a review of Russian activities targeting the election. Why would the administration not conduct this type of comprehensive review earlier, especially given the October 2016 public statement by DHS, ODNI, and the FBI regarding Russian cyber activity? Why the timing? Sure.
I think that they did take some investigative steps. It's debatable whether they should have taken more. I think to hear them tell it, they would say that they had to weigh the difference, the competing cost between what the reaction would have been if they had appeared to be putting their thumb on the scale in the middle of the campaign in an investigative way versus how do we stop Russia from doing what Russia was doing? And I think you can certainly argue whether they made the right value judgment there.
So is it appropriate then, though, for an outgoing administration to use these extensive resources of the CIA, NSA, and the Federal Bureau to conduct that assessment and publicly release that assessment, but not give the incoming, not consult with the incoming administration that that's what they were doing?
To my mind, the assessment is very peculiar in that, having worked in the government for a very long time, ordinarily the kind of an assessment that you're talking about there would be something that would take well over a year to do, certainly many months to do, even under circumstances where the information was readily available to investigators who had things like grand jury power in order to conduct the investigation. Seems to me that in this instance, there was a rush to get that out within a matter of days and then roll it out while President Obama was still president.
All three of you have, or at least Mr. Douglas and Mr. Anderson, have extensive careers with the FBI. Is it, I don't want to phrase the question, telegraphing the answer, but troubling relationships within the hierarchy of the top FBI and their attitude toward this Trump administration and the conflict of interest that seems to have, to most folks, have been in place. We're worried about a commercial transaction, openly commercial transaction that the Trump Tower would have been in Moscow. No way to hide that. There are no cutout entities being involved in between those. But yet folks at the top of the FBI, disdainful of the president, incoming president, conducting this investigation. Is that the standard for the FBI, or did you in the place police yourselves better than to show those conflicts of interest among the folks that are leading investigations? Sure.
So, I mean, I think, first of all, in any criminal or counterintelligence investigation period, it should be neutral. You should be looking at it a neutral playing field and developing the evidence to see where it leads you. And it should be able to stand on its own. So I think that is the way I worked it and was involved in cases for my whole career. As far as all the stuff that's gone on in the last couple of years, it's obviously very disconcerting about the different accusations that are taking place. I think that any of these investigations should have looked at specific facts and let the facts lead you where they go. It should not matter one iota if somebody's a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent.
Mr. Douglas, what was your experience?
Very, very similar to Bob's experience. You know, we were even talking earlier, we don't even know political preferences, and we've been friends for 2 decades. It's not, everybody comes into every position with a certain level of bias.
How did leadership fail? If that's the normal way of operating, how did it fail with respect to several of the top folks involved in the briefings of the campaign and other things going on? How did that happen? Where they had clear preferences for Trump getting beat, they had some sort of secret weapon. How did the system fail itself?
I have no idea. I can tell you, and we talked about this earlier, Pete Strzok was my chief of staff when I was the assistant director of counterintelligence. I never saw that side of what I saw in the emails and text messages. And those text messages and emails are unbelievably inappropriate. And I think the corrective action that was taken from that was just. But I can't answer your question, Congressman, because I didn't see it.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You go back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. A story we know all so well. Beginning in the spring and summer of 2016, the GRU hacks Clinton campaign manager John Podesta's email, the D-Trip, the DNC. The GRU then systematically released the hacked emails through their online personas, Lucifer, DC Leaks, as well as WikiLeaks. The Russians appear to have timed the releases to maximize the effort to harm the Clinton campaign, to maximize the benefit to the Trump campaign, according to the report. We also know in the report, there's a lot of evidence the Trump campaign knew about the WikiLeaks releases, welcomed them, strategized about how to amplify the message as part of the campaign. In fact, Donald Trump Jr. communicated directly with WikiLeaks in October of 2016 in an effort to use the hacked emails as to the campaign's advantage. The report indicates that the president himself knew about the planned dump of emails. Seems like an obvious question. From a counterintelligence perspective, what might this set of facts suggest about the relationship between the campaign and WikiLeaks? What might you worry about if a U.S. presidential campaign had foreknowledge of the release? More broadly, what counterintelligence risk exists when a campaign uses this information about a political opponent that was stolen and released by a foreign adversary? Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, sir. First of all, it troubles me that no one, if they did not communicate this type of information to some government agency just because of the facts laid out in the report and what you just brought up. I think also there needs to be a heightened sense of counterintelligence relationships as administrations move into the White House. I think in this administration, unlike other administrations that I've seen or been involved in preparing briefs for the president or whoever to read these to understand the concerns of it, I didn't see a lot of people within that, at least from the layman's eyes looking in from the outside, that even understood counterintelligence or understood that these threats were real. I think there should be a lot of that. The other point, and I think this is an important point, when Russia's releasing information through different, what I would call cutouts, i.e. WikiLeaks and other platforms, this is not unusual. In a lot of ways, they're doing that to start to sow the web so broad and wide, it's hard for us as an intelligence organization or group of intelligence organizations to start looking at who actually got that information, how did they get information, and why are they using it. That is done absolutely on purpose. It would not surprise me if there is a lot of other entities that the Russian intelligence services had teed up to even maybe displace more information that they never utilized. So going back to your original question, that's why it's so important. And individuals that are giving information, as Stephanie said, or being tasked and then receiving information, that is the initial way that you vet any asset or any person that you're targeting for a possible either unwitting asset or recruitment in the future. And those actions can take anywhere from a few weeks to years, depending how that organization is going to go after that person.
Ms. Douglas?
And I'd just like to add, I think if you're a foreign power and you have a campaign or individuals who are willing to entertain receiving information that you are collecting for their benefit, I think that is a tacit approval of that action. And I think that's where we have to be careful of allowing people to communicate to either a foreign government, a foreign actor, that what they're doing, which is illegal, by hacking and collecting information and then releasing it, giving that kind of approval by a head nod or a suggestion or any kind of inference that it's okay, is it a tacit approval of that kind of behavior? And I think that puts us at greater risk.
In the limited time I have, Mr. McCarthy, have you read the report in its entirety?
Well, I should say I've read all of Volume 1 because I knew that we were going to be discussing it today, and I've read most of Volume 2.
I appreciate that. You're ahead of most. You read then for about all the context that took place coming over from the Russian side. At any of those points, sir, putting yourself in the place of those who received those contacts, at any of those points, would you have called the FBI?
Well, I would
Yourself
have. Would
personally.
I have called the FBI?
Yes.
I call the FBI for things probably a lot less serious than that, I imagine. But
Thank you.
yeah, I do think.
However else you feel about the report, do you think someone should have called the FBI?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think there's no question, and my colleagues here have worked counterintelligence, I'm certain would tell you, we always want information, any information that would be helpful to us in apprising what the likely intentions of potentially hostile powers are. Where it gets dicey and where you have to be careful is if you are going to use investigative techniques that require a particular quantum of intelligence, then you have to make sure that you satisfy that quantum of intelligence before you trigger that technique. And that, I think, is where you go from the mere collection of information to doing something that's more active.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner.
I yield my 5 minutes to Congressman Radcliffe.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. McCarthy, in Volume 1 of the Mueller report, Bob Mueller details what he calls sweeping and systematic efforts to influence the 2016 election by the Russian government. Those details are largely set forth in 2 separate indictments, one identifying 12 Russian hackers associated with the GRU, and another one identifying 13 Russian individuals and 3 organizations part of Russia's Internet Research Agency. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes.
Did the special counsel find that those sweeping and systematic efforts to influence our election begin before or after Donald Trump's entry into the 2016 presidential field?
If I'm remembering correctly, he takes it back to 2014.
Was it also
Which is significantly before.
Was it also determined that Russia's sweeping and systematic efforts to interfere in the 2016 election not only predated Donald Trump's entry into the campaign, but also included some actions by the Russian government that were decidedly anti-Trump in nature?
Yeah, I think toward the end that in particular was true.
And was it based, Mr. McCarthy, on evidence gathered by a team of nearly 60 FBI agents and prosecutors over a 2-year period by Bob Mueller's team to make an evidence-based decision not to charge any American, much less anyone associated with the Trump campaign, with any complicity, with any conspiracy, with any collusion-related crime in Russia's election interference?
That's my understanding.
And yet, despite the special counsel's finding that neither Donald Trump or anyone associated with his campaign conspired or colluded with or was in any way successful in meddling in the 2016 presidential election, it's hard to argue that Russia wasn't successful in their ultimate goal of undermining the outcome of our election and sowing the seeds of discord in the American democratic process. We need look no further than this very room to see evidence of Russia's success. Our country just endured a 2-year investigation to determine whether or not the President of the United States was part of a treasonous conspiracy with a foreign adversary to steal an American election, yet the same Democratic Party that started the investigation into that alleged conspiracy that the special counsel conclusively and unequivocally established never existed, now convenes this hearing to talk about it some more. So let's talk about some of the reasons why the Russians might have been so successful in sowing the seeds of discord into the American public's mind. Let me ask you about some factors that may or may not have contributed to Russia's success. First, the Obama administration's decision not to advise candidate Trump during a defensive briefing in early August of 2017 about suspected Russian interference or infiltration into his campaign, while simultaneously opening a probe of the Trump campaign using foreign counterintelligence spying authorities. Do you think that might have been a factor that contributed to Russia's success?
To Russia's success in sowing discord into the body politic?
Yes.
I don't know if Russia goes tactic by tactic. I'll say this. I think Russia succeeded beyond its wildest dreams, if that is what its intentions were. I don't think that necessarily means that particular entreaties by Russians to people who were connected to any campaign is something that isn't alarming and shouldn't have raised people's hackles up.
So let me ask you, the Obama administration's intelligence community assessment that you referred to earlier, which was used to tell the American public that not only did Russia interfere with the 2016 election, but did so because Vladimir Putin was trying to get Donald Trump elected. Do you think that might have been a factor in Russia's success?
Well, I think in terms of sowing discord into our body politic, the fact that particular conclusion does not seem to me to be compelling, given what the evidence is and given what we understand Putin's general approach to the United States and the West is. I don't think it helps to have people come out and say, you know, Putin was in Trump's camp, when it appears that if we look at everything Putin does everywhere, Putin is in the camp of the people he thinks are going to lose because he thinks that's better for him.
The Obama administration's use of FISA warrants obtained through verified applications based on the unverified Steele dossier, which the Obama Justice Department and the FBI knew to be an uncorroborated Clinton campaign opposition research document. Do you think that was a factor that contributed to Russia's success?
I think we don't know everything we need to know about the FISA applications, but from what I've seen of them, I think they certainly should have been more forthcoming with the court about what the provenance of the dossier was.
And when Obama
The
administration...
time of the gentleman has expired.
I appreciate the chairman's indulgence, since he asked questions for 7 minutes and 27 seconds. Could I have an additional minute to finish my remarks?
Chairman and the ranking member's prerogative to go beyond the 5 minutes.
I understand. I'm just asking for your indulgence.
We may have time for one last question.
Well, obviously, I only have 5 minutes has expired, and I've run out of time to stop listing all of the other things that the Obama administration did or didn't do to cause or contribute to the success of Russia in undermining the 2016 election. So since the purpose of this hearing, Mr. McCarthy, is to learn lessons from the Mueller report, do you think it's fair for a lot of the questions that this committee needs to be asking to understand and to hopefully prevent Russia's success in undermining future elections ought to be focused on the administration of President Obama rather than President Trump?
I think it would be a very good thing for the country if we had a common understanding that Putin has it in for us whether this country is being run by Republicans or Democrats, and that what his objective is to destabilize the United States so that we can't pursue and protect our interest in the world, which is good for Russia.
I very much appreciate the chairman's indulgence. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Add my expression of gratitude to all the panelists for their being here. So by now we know that the Mueller report included numerous examples of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, and we know that the special counsel in his public presentation closed his remarks by suggesting that absolutely every American should be concerned about this. I know we all are. Instead, however, of addressing what FBI Director Wray described as an ongoing threat, contrasted to that, we have the president who has attacked the special counsel's investigation, attacked the FBI, generally tried to undermine the work product of the Mueller investigation. More to the point of this hearing, the president has called Russia's attacks at various times and repeatedly on our democracy, quote, a hoax. And he has literally sided, as we famously know, with Vladimir Putin over our own intelligence agencies. Considering that past is often prologue, we are all greatly concerned that similar interference will occur in the future. So for my question, which I think I want to start with Mr. Anderson, I want to briefly tell this story. I had the great privilege to serve as chief of staff to a governor in Washington State, Booth Gardner, several decades ago. One budget cycle, we didn't have the money to propose as high a salary increase for public employees as they sought. That difference of opinion became quite manifestly contentious. The governor had accepted an invitation to go to our Capitol rotunda to address the public employees for many months, and when he went out, there weren't hundreds, there were thousands there, and they lined the walls in several levels, and it was difficult for him to give his remarks because they were expressing their understandable frustration in quite loud terms. Walking back to our office, I turned to the governor and asked, I don't understand why you didn't more affirmatively defend your point of view. And I'll never forget what he told me. He turned to me and he said, Denny, that's our workforce. If we are going to accomplish anything, it is going to be with that workforce. Those are our people. We are only able to do what we can do through them. So my question, Mr. Anderson, is as a former senior official at the FBI, despite the public statements of stiff upper lip, we're professionals, we put our heads down, we go to work every day. Is the Bureau and, most importantly, our workforce, those dedicated professionals, completely immune from these attacks by the President of the United States? And I know you're not there now, but if you were there, I'd be curious as to what your reaction would have been to that and what you think might be the reaction by the workforce. And do you think that they would be concerned about their job or their work in light of, frankly, unwarranted attacks?
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, I've never seen anything like this in my almost 30 years of law enforcement. Two, I think the FBI for over 100 years has been through a lot of ups and downs, but I personally think it's taken a toll. Look, the men and women of the United States intelligence community, the FBI, they're going to go to work and give 110% every day and work 18 hours every day. People don't see that, but I do think this takes a toll. And the one thing that I will tell you, when it comes to Russia and many other nation states to this country, they didn't just start on this thing back in 2014, what this report says, and they didn't go away. They're not leaving. I can guarantee you they're still here looking at the next presidential election and figuring out how they can attack it through SIGINT, HUMINT, cyber, or any other way they can. And I think overall, I think that does take an effect.
Ms. Douglas, thinking more prospectively, because our primary concern here is what we can do to avoid this kind of interference in the future. Do you believe that there would be a net gain or a benefit if we created an affirmative duty to report anytime that there is this kind of contact with foreign representatives?
I think it would have to be very well crafted, given that people come in contact all the time with foreign nationals. It is a global world.
I mean representatives, official representatives of a presidential campaign.
I think even then, you're going to have to be very careful on how you would do that. I just think that there's so much interaction in the global world, even here in D.C. There's so many opportunities to meet people. For the most part, they're not malicious. They're not intelligence officers. I think it's, possibly something to consider, but again, it would have to be very well crafted, that it would be appropriate and would be something that you could actually do and be able to hold people accountable to.
So my time has expired, obviously. We still beg the question that I hope we'll get a chance to get into is what your recommendations would be to avoid this kind of interference moving forward. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. As a veteran, I have always tried to put my country first. And, through all of this that we're talking about, I think one of the things I'm most disturbed about is that an American political party would hire a foreign agent who works with agents of a foreign power, namely Russians, to create a fake document to attempt to destroy their American political opponent. And yet many in authority seemingly completely choose to ignore that that's not part of the conversation. In 2018, the committee's then majority found no evidence of collusion, coordination, or conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. We did address Russian interference and their tactics and what we would try to do in the future to disseminate that. 2 years ago on this committee, which was my second term on this committee, things changed. We were very nonpartisan. It changed and the division on this committee grew, and I sat here and I said to the entire committee, what's going on right now is exactly what Mr. Putin wants. We're giving him everything he has worked for. And as you said, I think beyond his wildest dreams. We have. But through all this, here we are. And with a team of approximately 19 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, intelligence and analysts, forensic accountants, and other professional staff, the Special Counsel's Office, which issued more than 2,800 subpoenas, executed nearly 500 search warrants, interviewed nearly 500 witnesses, and made nearly 13 requests to foreign governments, concluded that the investigation did not establish that the members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Mr. McCarthy, do you believe Special Counsel's office was properly resourced to conduct a thorough investigation
I think they had more than the resources they needed.
and had appropriate access to and investigative tools?
So far as I know, I can only answer these questions as a person analyzing it from the outside who has like some.
But you have experience in this arena, and so your perception is...
I have no reason to think that they didn't have everything they needed in the way of access and resources.
And I would suggest, and you can agree or disagree, they had more access and tools than any congressional committee has.
That's on you, Doctor. I don't
Well, I believe that to be the case. But with all these resources at hand, I find it hard to believe the Special Counsel's office, if they had all these tools, that they likely would have found more than circumstantial evidence of collusion if it had existed in plain sight. Well, let me ask you this. How are confidential human sources in counterintelligence investigations vetted?
The FBI has generally speaking, a pretty, I mean, it can vary from person to person, and these are very, the human dynamic, in my experience, of dealing with informants never goes away. So there are peculiarities and eccentricities that you have to deal with on both the informant side and the agent side, and it's often very difficult work for the agent, because I was a prosecutor. The agent has to take the brunt of some of the more crazy stuff so that the prosecutors can, focus on the case.
Are they vetted once, or are they vetted over and over again? Or are they vetted every time? Maybe someone else would like to answer that question.
They are vetted more than once. They're vetted regularly. They're tested, depending on how you use an asset. If you're operationally tasking an asset, there are ways you can test your asset to make sure that they're providing credible information. They go through a vetting system on a regular basis. Their files are reviewed at a supervisory level. They can be pulled and audited for any purpose by headquarters and another asset review.
My time is short, but I appreciate your answer. And so if the FBI were to run a confidential human source into a U.S. political campaign or against individuals associated with the campaign, would the FBI notify someone in the campaign to let them know that that was happening? And if not, why not?
Ordinarily, no. If you're investigating the campaign, you wouldn't notify the campaign. Now, there's a difference.
But if it's not the candidate, but someone in the campaign, and you have no evidence that the candidate is doing this, wouldn't you want to let the candidate know, the nominee for President of the United States, that someone in their campaign may be doing this? It seems to me you're in a different position at that time.
Well, but I do think that this goes to what some of the members of the committee have mentioned, which is the idea of whether you do a defensive briefing or not. I think if what you think is that you have some people who are in the orbit of the campaign who are problematic, that might be something you'd give the campaign a heads up in the connection of doing a defensive briefing. If you've decided that everything in the Steele dossier is true and the candidate is the problem, I don't see how you would notify the campaign, since the candidate is the one person the campaign's not going to get rid of.
Well, if someone in my campaign was doing something nefarious and engaging with a hostile foreign entity, I would sure hope I was informed. I yield back.
Ms. Sewell.
So my line of questioning has to do with the 14 pages in the Mueller report that deals with Papadopoulos' meeting with Joseph Mifsud. According to the Mueller report, in late April 2016, Papadopoulos was told by the London-based professor Joseph Mifsud immediately after his return from a trip to Moscow that the Russian government had obtained dirt on, and that's a quotation from the Mueller report, this is, had obtained dirt on candidate Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. 1 week later, on May 6, 2016, Papadopoulos suggested to a representative of a foreign government that the Trump campaign had received indications from the Russian government that it would assist the campaign through the anonymous release of information that would be damaging to candidate Clinton. Mr. Anderson, it appears to me that, from reading of the Mueller report, that Joseph Misfit was cultivated and communicated sensitive information to George Papadopoulos, who by March 2016 had been publicly named as the foreign policy advisor to then candidate Trump. Why might this type of cultivation raise flags at the Bureau? I would suggest that the fact that he was so engaged with Papadopoulos that he was a proxy of the Kremlin in that case, in this case. Can you elaborate a little bit about your thoughts about that meeting between Papadopoulos and Misfit and what red flags that would raise? And how a foreign power would seek to leverage a relationship like that to its own intelligence gathering or policy objectives?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the things people need to realize is when foreign powers are actually going at individuals to try to gain access or potentially recruit or use them unwittingly, it's not like you see on TV. A lot of the times, the people that are coming at people, they intentionally, and I don't know if he was a source of the Russian government or not, but they will utilize individuals in academia, they will utilize people in certain social sections, they will utilize people outside of threatening environments to where you're meeting with an official of the Russian government. And so for people like me that have worked this for a very long time and seen thousands of these different types of cases, that does raise the level of suspicion. Now, the one thing that troubles me even more is once the tasking starts. And as Stephanie said earlier, I cannot tell you when it comes to validating, vetting, potentially recruiting, or just seeing if this is somebody that you should potentially spot and assess for later recruitment, this is a big deal. And they're going to watch to see what the information is given and then given back to that individual. So from an academic side, I can tell you that the Russians' intelligence services use this a lot.
Yep.
And they also use it in different circles.
So, Ms. Douglas, Papadopoulos was told by Joseph Misfit that Russia had Clinton emails, and crucially, of Russia's desire to release them anonymously, well before that fact became public. Why might a foreign adversary like Russia want to provide such sensitive information to someone like Papadopoulos, a presidential campaign staffer, and why might what might they seek to gain from having that?
Right. You know, one of the things I thought was very interesting is Papadopoulos said that he was of no interest initially when he met Mr. Misfit, right? Until he told him that he was involved with the campaign. And then all of a sudden, there was this re-engagement after he returned from Moscow. He is one of the many areas where they're looking for opportunities. And they're looking to establish relationships that maybe are not overly successful on that first once or twice where they actually have conversations, but they want to establish a relationship for the future. George Papadopoulos wasn't a heavy player in the campaign. You know, he was very early on with his assignment at the campaign when they started having conversations, but the Russians know that, hey, he's early on with the campaign now. He could potentially be with the administration in the future, and we want to get in good with him now.
And you know, through Misfit and another Russian national, Papadopoulos was introduced to members of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Papadopoulos used his relationship with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to push for a secret meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. What sort of countervailing counterintelligence risks might a secret meeting between a candidate, Trump, and Vladimir Putin generate?
Well, obviously, pre-election, trying to set up a meeting between a candidate and, you know, a leader of our most significant adversary outside normal channels, and Papadopoulos putting himself in that position where he could actually arrange it, honestly puts the campaign at even greater jeopardy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Stewart. Thank you, Ms. Douglas. I appreciate what you said. You said something exactly right. I love the fact that you and Mr. Anderson worked side by each other and was not aware of each other's political views. That's the way it should be for law enforcement professionals especially. And when I listen to Mr. Comey, director of the FBI, Mr. Brennan, director of the CIA, the director of national intelligence, they sound like political hacks. And I wonder, how in the world could someone so political and so partisan be selected to such a position of leadership? You two set a much, much better example of that. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you had this hearing. It gives us a chance to tell the American people the truth. It took courage to hold a hearing that demonstrates that much of what people have heard for the last 2 years simply is not true. And to emphasize what the Mueller report clearly found, the special counsel did not find the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired, coordinated with Russian government, despite multiple efforts by Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign. And I'd like to emphasize something that I feel very strongly about, and I think the American people feel very strongly about this. It's unfair. In fact, I think it's un-American to make accusations about people without evidence, to destroy the lives of and the presumption of innocence, to destroy people's professional lives, to destroy them financially, to try them in the media when they don't have the ability to defend themselves. The American people know these things aren't fair, and the Mueller report and hearings such as this give us a chance to emphasize that. I'd like to dive into what is one of the more troubling aspects of this episode, and that is the FISA application. FISA application is a very, very intrusive tool. It allows someone to essentially survey your email, your text, your personal contacts, family and friends. I'm going to use a word, and heads are going to explode, but essentially allows you to spy on U.S. citizens. And yet, knowing the FISA application was based on the Steele dossier, Mr. McCarthy, I'll start with you. Should the FBI have taken steps to verify the contents of the Steele dossier prior to including it in the FISA application?
I believe they should have. I think that Steele was in the position not of a source of information, but an accumulator of. He's in this equation, he's much more like a case agent than a source. Generally speaking, for prosecutors and courts in any warrant situation, whether it's a FISA warrant or not, the source information are the people who see and hear, make the observations that the court is being asked to rely on for purposes of probable cause. It generally doesn't matter whether your case agent is credible, it's whether the source information.
Well, and this is stating the painfully obvious. The FBI should verify information before presenting it before the FISA courts. We all agree on that.
Before any court, but yes.
Before any court, absolutely. Especially,
If you mean by verify, corroborate, yes.
yeah, absolutely, especially with the FISA court, though, because there is no defender of the person being accused in this case. And I'm sure the three of you are familiar with the Steele dossier. Is that true?
I've never read the Steele
Never read
dossier.
it? Mr. Anderson?
I have not read it either, sir.
Okay.
I've read it.
Well, I would, okay, Mr. McCarthy, thank you. I would challenge you or anyone who's read the Steele dossier to tell us anything in there that we now know is true. Do you know of any accusation made in the Steele dossier that we know now is true?
There are a number of assertions that are made in the Steele dossier which are true but of not great
Irrelevant.
importance. Like, for example, we know that Carter Page did go to Moscow in July, for example.
but that's
what
not-
he did there is the subject of a great deal of back and forth.
Right.
But whether he went there or not, which the Steele dossier asserts, is not, I don't think, in conflict.
Well, and so that's not an accusation because that's not a crime going to Moscow. It's the
Well,
things-
none of it is, when you're dealing in counterintelligence, none of it is necessarily a crime.
crime.
The question is whether he's acting as an agent of a foreign power.
And so my point being is that this thing, which was almost entirely the basis for the FISA application, we now know that almost all the accusations in there are not true. None of them have been proven true. And so that then begs the second question, and that is, to your knowledge, and I'll ask any of the three of you because you surely have knowledge of this, has the FBI ever used political opposition research funded by a U.S. political campaign and including information from foreign agents in a counterintelligence investigation? Mr. Anderson, are you aware of that ever happening before?
I'm not aware of anything. It doesn't mean that it hasn't potentially happened before, but I'm not aware.
Okay, Ms. Douglas?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any prior use.
Ms. McCarthy?
Yeah, may I just say, I've taken information from the worst people on the planet. I've taken information from terrorists. I've taken it from murderers, from swindlers. When you do this kind of work, the people that you get information from tend not to be, you know, the kinds of people. The question is, what do you do with the information when you get it? And the more suspect that the source of the information is, the more and higher your obligation is to verify it before you use it in any way that's going to intrude on anyone's rights.
Yeah, thank you. My time has expired. We'll talk again. Thank you.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to ask you about Michael Flynn and particularly his relationship and his actions with respect to the Russian ambassador Kislyak and his attempt to undermine the Obama administration's sanctions that were put into place in December 2016. Michael Flynn used secret back-channel discussions with the Russian ambassador to, in effect, undermine the Obama administration's ongoing foreign policy. So my question is, what counterintelligence concerns arise from this type of back-channel coordination between an incoming presidential administration and a foreign adversary? Why would the FBI be concerned with an incoming national security advisor conducting foreign policy before the new president has ever taken office, and also without informing the State Department?
Well, first of all, one of the things when it comes to back-channel communications on political or national security issues or views from the White House, one of the things that Russia and other significant nation-states intelligence organizations try to have that created. And the reason they do is they try to get the current administration, whether it's the one that's currently in there now or whenever, having their public face confused with what either the State Department's saying or people that are saying stuff through a back channel. This is absolutely the exact same thing that was going on with the Maria Butina case, which I was the expert for the Department of Justice 4 weeks ago at her sentencing. And they will do it at different levels. So regardless if it's a national security advisor to the president, which once the individual moves into office, it's not unusual for them to be talking to a multitude of ambassadors. The key here is Russia wants to get the administration, whatever administration that is, off balance with what their real political views are and potential back channels.
And I would just obviously agree that it immediately put the existing administration in a horribly conflicted position, and they didn't know it. By the back channel in advance of inauguration, it jeopardized how the U.S. was viewed by the Russians, and also it probably assured the Russians that they were going to get a more favored treatment by the incoming administration. And even Mike Flynn says that when he says, I didn't put any of this in an email or notes because I thought it looked like we were undermining the current administration. And indeed, that's exactly what he was doing.
And, the Mueller report explains that Flynn had a pre-existing relationship with Russia going back to at least late 2015 when he traveled to Moscow to attend an event organized by the Russian state-backed media outlet RT, at which he sat next to Vladimir Putin himself. Flynn also reportedly met secretly with Ambassador Kislyak on several occasions during the transition period in December 2016. And so my question is, what do you make of this relationship in particular, and given Flynn's role as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the incoming National Security Advisor? And how might Russia exploit this relationship with Flynn to affect United States policy?
I'll just speak from my own personal experience. Obviously, having known and worked with Mike Flynn, I would say it was a very surprising position for him to take. Obviously, he had very high-level access to information, and then seeing that as a close business and personal relationship was concerning.
Anyone else?
I would just say, going back, and this all goes back to the clearance process and having sustainable clearances above the secret level of TSSCI with very well-defined reporting requirements. I mean, I would report yearly just to maintain your top secret clearance as Assistant Director of Counterintelligence, traveling around the world, engaging with foreign intelligence organizations, hundreds of contacts of individuals that would either talk to me, stop by, have a conversation. And I think part of this is when it gets into the aspect of when individuals aren't reporting that, and the second they start having clandestine or secret meetings, it puts them in a very vulnerable position.
It leaves them open to blackmail and...
Well, it's definitely a vulnerable position because there's nobody in the room with you that can say, hey, here's exactly how the conversation went. So And these are all tricks of the trade when it comes to hostile adversaries and intelligence services.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here today. In 2017, former CIA Director Brennan stated in an open hearing in this committee that Russian active measures to impact U.S. had been going on for decades. In 2012, then candidate for president Romney stated he believed Russia posed the greatest threat to the United States, to which President Obama replied, the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. In 2014, then Chairman, now Ranking Member Nunes warned of Russian malign influence campaigns. All of this acknowledgement of Russia and their intentions, and yet no response from the Obama administration. So there's a lot of conspiracy theories swirling around about Russia collusion, so let's just add this one. Is it possible that a group of politically motivated individuals at the highest echelons of national security decided to turn a blind eye to this activity, feeling that it would in fact enhance their candidate's chances of winning? I don't expect you to answer that, but I do expect you to consider it. And with that, I'll yield to Mr. Ratcliffe the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to follow up on Mr. Stewart's line of questioning about the FISA process and the Steele dossier's role in that. According to sworn testimony given by former DOJ Associate Deputy Attorney General Bruce Orr, he said under oath that he had advised Andy McCabe, Deputy Director of the FBI, Peter Strzok, and Lisa Page at the FBI in early August of 2016 that Christopher Steele was in fact motivated and desperate to stop a Trump presidency. Separately, documents that have now been made public pursuant to a FOIA request indicate that a State Department employee, Kathleen Kavalek, advised the FBI that about concerns over Christopher Steele's credibility based in part on his assertion that this well-developed conspiracy with Russia was being run out of the Russian consulate in Miami, where Russia does not have a consulate. Mr. McCarthy, I want to ask you to tell me what you think about that information and whether and how that information about Christopher Steele should have impacted how the Steele and whether the Steele dossier should have been presented to the FISA court. And you mentioned it, but I think it's worth mentioning again to also address as part of that whether or not it was appropriate to represent Christopher Steele as a source of information in that application.
Yeah, my main overarching problem with it is that I think it was objectionable to take somebody who was in the position of really of a case agent and refer to him and treat him as if he were a source when he did not make the observations that the court was being asked to rely on for purposes of probable cause. Now, if you want to take the position that I'm wrong about that, then I think the second thing that has to be said is that the more remote that somebody is from the observations you're asking a court to rely on, the more you have to do in the way of being transparent as far as what that person's biases are, potentially. It's one thing to say that, you know, somebody who sees something criminal happen brings a lot of baggage to the table, but they either saw what they saw or they didn't, and the circumstances surrounding that can tell you a lot more than their bias can. If you're talking about somebody who's remote from that, and here we're talking about somebody who may be 3, 4, 5 hearsay steps remote from it, I think you have a higher obligation to be straight with the court about what that person's baggage is in terms of bias, motivation, economic motivation, whatever. And just a rule of thumb, and I think any good federal judge would tell you this, if you need to write a footnote that takes a page and a half in order to avoid writing the sentence, and he's connected to the Clinton campaign, then you should probably disclose that he's connected to the Clinton campaign.
Thank you. Ms. Douglas or Mr. Anderson, anything about what Mr. McCarthy just related that you would disagree with or want to clarify?
You know, I'll just add that on the counterintelligence and on the counterterrorism side, we take information from sources that aren't right there. And it's been critically important in a lot of cases, especially in the counterterrorism world, where you have a person who's receiving information or hears of information that you make every effort to validate and corroborate, and is that source trusted? And that's where you really have to look to see, has that source provided reliable information in the past? And I am not defending the Steele dossier, and I don't even think that comes up in the Mueller report, actually. But I would just say that the FBI did have reliable reporting, from Steele in the past, and maybe that gave them some assurance to it. And then also, I think it's important for everyone to know, the Steele dossier wasn't stapled to a cover sheet for the FISA application. The FISA application has more information than just the Steele dossier. And I do think that that is important to know.
Real quick, sir, just two things. One is the court needs to have complete transparency in any FISA or Title III about any information, full stop. It should never be anything other than that. And the last thing I would say is after a FISA or Title III is running, and you can use either nowadays in counterintelligence depending what you're doing, if you find out something about the information you've supplied to the court after it's running and it's inaccurate, it is incumbent upon us to go back to the court and explain that to the court. That's the only other 2 points.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and I yield back.
Mr. Maloney.
Thank the witnesses for being here. Just to return for a minute to Paul Manafort and the issue of sharing intelligence, sharing internal polling data. Consider the following from the Mueller report. Quote, because of questions about the polling data after it was sent to Kalimnik, the office could not assess what Kalimnik or others he may have given it to did with it. Close quote. Further, the report notes that, quote, Gates believed Manafort sent polling data to Deripaska so that Deripaska would not move forward with his lawsuit against Manafort, close quote. Manafort also briefed Kalimnik on the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win, including campaign messaging and a discussion of battleground states, including Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. What are the counterintelligence concerns about that the chairman of a presidential campaign would be providing that kind of information?
I think Paul Manafort is trying to sell himself, right? So, I mean, he clearly talks about his time on the campaign being good for his business. His plan was to go out and monetize his expertise after the campaign.
And excuse me.
No, I'm just saying, I think he is providing polling data. He is talking to Kalimnik. He is doing everything he can to put his name out there with oligarchs, which are very much part of the intelligence apparatus for the Russian government.
This is the senior person on the Trump campaign at the time. Yes. And I'm intrigued by your point about tasking. And I'd just like you to return to that for a minute, because isn't that really the magic moment? Isn't the magic moment when you've done all this work and you've been cultivating people like this and you tiptoe up to them and you use all these unoffensive contacts to get near them, and then you give them something to do that's wrong,
right,
that's inappropriate, and they know it's wrong, and they do it. Isn't that when you got them?
Yes, of course, and it just continues to increase. And, you know, that's why I said, I mean, the Trump administration is so lucky to have Paul Manafort out of there, because Manafort was not going to stop at polling data.
Because it's a test, right?
It's
if
a
he'll
test.
do that, he'll do the next thing. And the deeper they get in, the more they got to keep going, right?
Yeah.
And so it's fair to say, had he stayed on as chairman, they would have kept tasking him, right?
I would definitely assume that.
And that's how you get in deeper and deeper and deeper. Isn't that fair to say?
Yes.
And it wouldn't just be him, right? It would be others that they're attempting and endeavoring to do this with.
Well, I mean, it was very apparent that the Russians were in communication with a number of Trump associates and trying to establish these relationships. You know, who knows how far they would have gotten with certain people, but Manafort made himself available. He thought it was good for himself financially. He thought it could get him out of hock financially with some of the debts that were already owed as far as this lawsuit. And, you know, he continued to really advertise his availability to them.
Fair to say that's a counterintelligence nightmare, Mr. Anderson?
Well, it's not. It might not be a nightmare, but it's definitely something to be extremely concerned about, because as as was just discussed, that tasking will continue to whoever until you say no, and that's when the extortion starts, right? And so that's when we talked about this several times in this committee. It's Bob's your best friend right up to the point that you don't give me what I'm asking for.
Right. Mr. McCarthy, I'm very struck by your answer to Mr. Quigley's question, that you would hope that someone in the position of the Trump campaign officials would come to the FBI. You said you want them to come to the FBI, right? And in fact, one of the reasons that you said you wanted that was because you like the information. The FBI always wants more information. I understand that. But isn't it also the case that the reason that person comes to the FBI is to inoculate themselves against the very charge that they're playing footsie with a foreign intelligence service? Isn't that right?
Yeah.
And in fact, sir, if they did that, you would need a counterintelligence investigation because you'd be working in partnership with the Americans in concert with their own government against that foreign interference. Isn't that fair?
Well, yes, although on the government side of it, you also have to be very careful that they're not playing both sides. You can get played that way too, and that happens more often probably.
Played by whom?
By the person who comes in to report to you.
Fair enough, but in this case, it was true. In this case, it was part of a systemic effort we now know.
What you're saying is,
Mr. McCarthy, had they just told the FBI, as you yourself said you wish they had,
right,
there wouldn't have been a counterintelligence investigation at that point, right?
Well, but what you're saying is true. I'm having trouble following because I've read the report. I don't think we're skipping a step here. I don't think that there's evidence that Kalimnik is a Russian asset. There's a lot of reason to be concerned about it. There's a lot of also information that Kalimnik was an asset for the State Department. The connection that Kalimnik had to Russian intelligence goes back 20 years ago.
Forget about Kalimnik. What about the Trump Tower meeting?
You guys are saying he was tasked. How do we know he was tasked? There's no evidence that he was tasked.
I'm not asking you about Kalimnik. Excuse me, my time's expired. But with the chairman's indulgence, the Trump Tower meeting, or any of the improper contexts that we now know were part of this effort by the Russian intelligence services. My point is, sir, if the Trump campaign had simply picked up the phone and called the FBI and said, "We're worried about this," it would have gone a long way to inoculating them against the concern that they were working in concert with a foreign intelligence operation.
I couldn't agree more with that,
Thank you very much.
and I think anybody who thinks that they've been approached by a Russian asset should notify the FBI.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from California, Ranking Member Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Hurd. Appreciate that. I just want to take time to clarify a few things. Is it a crime for any American to appear on RT and take money from RT? I'm not aware that it is.
No.
I'm a little confused as to, I don't want to put words in any of the witnesses' mouth, but maybe it was from folks up here on the dais. But we have numerous former government officials and current government officials that appear on RT all the time and take money from it. I'm a little alarmed that people would make some type of reference that the former head of the DIA who goes to the DIA to tell them, hey, I'm going to go and meet with Putin, I'm going to get paid to go on RT, goes there, does it, then reports back that somehow, now I don't know that other former government officials are doing that same thing when they take large sums of money, but to hear people, you know, whether it's, I don't want to put words in any of your mouth, but I thought that that's what I heard, that it wasn't okay for the former head of DIA to go and give a speech like all former politicians and presidents do. Did I hear that? Is it okay for General Flynn to go to RT or is it not?
I mean, I think people do it all the time in the private sector and go give speeches. I think as long as that's what it is, it's fine.
I mean, I know that General Hayden, a friend of mine, friend of this committee for a long time, I mean, he was, I don't know if he was paid by RT or not, but he did many appearances on RT. The other thing that is a little alarming to me is this talk that General Flynn, by talking to the Russian ambassador when he's the incoming national security advisor, would be somehow targeted by the FBI or any counterintelligence capability in this country when he's just talking to the Russian ambassador, even if he doesn't agree with the Obama administration on sanctions. Because if that's the case, I mean, John Kerry should be under a full-blown criminal investigation for violating the Logan Act right now. Should John Kerry be under investigation right now for violating the Logan Act, Mr. Anderson?
I have no idea what John Kerry's doing. I mean,
Well, it's been widely reported that John Kerry has had numerous meetings with the Iranian regime during the Trump administration.
I would have to see a lot more about that, sir. I have no idea. I mean, as far as, going back to your original question, sir, as far as like the incoming national security advisor talking to the Russian ambassador on its own, I mean, that's not something that's going to raise a counterintelligence flag. You have to look at the totality of what's going on. I don't understand anything outside of this report that went on with Mike Flynn, who I also know, and the ambassador, but that wouldn't on its own trigger any type of national security flag.
While it may not trigger an investigation, I think you have to be mindful of how that looks to the Russian government. And that's why I said it could be a counterintelligence concern, right? It may not trigger an investigation, but
I just think it's preposterous for me to think that a three-star general, the architect of killing terrorists, really bad al-Qaeda terrorists, is somehow connected to the Russian government. And I mean, you know, for him talking to the Russian ambassador, I just think is, that's what we
didn't say that.
expect. I would expect, no matter if it's Democrat or Republican administration coming in, that whoever the national security team is, that they would talk to the Russian ambassador, or any ambassador for that matter. I also don't think, as much as I disagree with John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, I also don't think that he should be investigated for violating the Logan Act right now, just to get that on the record. However, some on this side of the aisle, on the left, and the media have continued to bash General Flynn for talking to the Russian ambassador, but at the same time, they say nothing about Secretary Kerry meeting with the Iranians.
I don't think it was just talking to the Russian ambassador. I think that's what the difference is here. I think General Flynn reached out in what he considered to be an official position prior to the inauguration of the Trump administration and decided to do foreign policy work in the midst of another administration. And I think
that is no different than what John Kerry is doing right now.
I'm sorry. I
So
don't
you
know
would want to
what
investigate John
Kerry's doing.
Kerry.
No, I'm not saying anybody gets investigated here, but I am saying it is a counterintelligence concern. And it's just like where we are saying that, yes, no criminal charge has been filed relative to Mueller's findings, it still does not mean that there is not a national security threat.
Well, I don't think I'd be putting John Kerry under a counterintelligence investigation anytime soon. I have one more question on tasking. You guys mentioned that Manafort was tasked to deliver polling information. I'm a little troubled as to what the difference is between somebody asking for polling information versus a political campaign hiring a former British spy to go out and meet with what we now know to be, or supposedly, reportedly, and from notes at the State Department, meeting with high-ranking former SVR, GRU officials in the Russian government to get dirt on Trump. That's a tasking. I mean, that's a campaign paying for it. How is that any different? Matter of fact, I would say the other is worse. We may not like how political campaigns are run, but I don't think any of that's illegal. Any response?
I think it's very disturbing that the Clinton campaign used steel. I think it's disturbing that the Russians reached out to the Trump campaign. There's a lot of talk about Deripaska, what a terrible guy Deripaska is. I agree, he's a terrible guy. Steele also worked for him. You know, I mean, we're in a situation where for 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, this government, bipartisan, has taken the position essentially that Russia's a country we can work with. The Bush administration used to call them a strategic partner in connection with certain things. The Obama administration wanted to reset relations with them. Trump wanted to chase the panacea of having better relations with them. If you're going to have that approach, it wouldn't be my approach, but if you're going to have that approach, you're going to have a lot of people having a lot of contacts with Russians. And we have a lot of people having contacts with Russians, and a lot of it's really inappropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much, and I thank the witnesses. The Mueller report describes efforts by the Kremlin to establish a back channel. And you spoke about how when they're, Mr. Anderson, they're always looking for many points of contact so they don't have a single point of failure. But for example, in January 2017, Mr. Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund and obviously close ally of Mr. Putin, met with Trump's surrogate Eric Prince in the Seychelles. Prince later relayed what Dmitriev told him to Steve Bannon, and then separately in late November of 2016, Dmitriev began communicating with Rick Gerson, who was a friend of Jared Kushner. And over the next few months, Dmitriev worked with Gerson on a plan for reconciliation between Russia and the United States, which Gerson then funneled to Kushner. The Mueller report suggests that this memo, which was essentially drafted by the Russian government in which Dmitriev told Gerson was approved by Putin, may have influenced Trump's first phone call as president. Can you explain this concept a little bit more of back channel and what sorts of counterintelligence risk can arise from such back channels? And the reason I ask is we're having a back and forth here, understandably, about political motivations. And in campaigns, campaigns tend to push the limits. But what appears to me to be unique about this is that Russians have information which becomes a tool for them to advance their policy interests as opposed to ours. Mr. Anderson?
Yes, sir, thank you. 2 points. One is you're absolutely right. One, it's for them to be able to be put in a position to advance whatever they're looking to gain from the United States instead of us. But two, it's also there to cause confusion and discord, right? Because as this different opposing policies or back channels start to go up through the different channels, it causes discord within those different organizations and up eventually to whoever's trying to get the official policy through, whether it's at the State Department or at the White House. The one thing you will see, and I've seen it in this report, is with Russia, going back to the point about looking at different channels to try to make those things happen, you actually start putting people against each other, even inside the same office, because they don't understand that what is the official channel versus what we're hearing from the back channels.
So when you say within an office, you mean like the FBI or the CIA or
Office
the
of the
State
President,
Department?
bigger, Office of the President, the State Department, other areas within our country. And they'll do it not necessarily just right around the individuals who are located within there making the policies, but they'll also do it outside of that. And last point I'll make is one thing I think we really need to do is look larger also when it comes to Russia attacking our political infrastructure than just what we're looking at right here. Because I can guarantee you, again, I referenced the one trial I was the expert in a few weeks ago for DOJ. That is identical to what we're talking about. It's the same type of political back channels.
All right, Ms. Douglas, thank you. Would you care to elaborate on this? Again, the focus for me is not campaigns pushing the limits so much as candidates becoming compromised by some of the actions that they take or information that they share. For instance, having a business in transaction involving multi-million-dollar potential profit obviously creates an incentive to protect that investment. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important, and I think the report lays out how well Putin really puts to work all these Russian billionaires with outreach and connections to a number of associates and friends of family and friends of friends. And that's a good example. The reconciliation plan really is kind of a strategy document by Dmitriev, who's very closely aligned with Putin. I think he refers to Putin as his boss, and a friend of Jared Kushner's. And putting those two people together to come up and work on this plan, which they then present internal to be used for this call.
Let me just follow up on that, because my understanding is that it was our official policy during the Obama administration to oppose the expansion into the Ukraine. And then there was an ongoing debate that's carried over into this administration about whether to provide significant new armaments for the Ukraine fighting the Russians. So the two seem to be in conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think just having that kind of external input into a very early stage administrative strategy appears to be very unusual.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all. When the June 9, 2016 meeting at Trump Tower was proposed to Donald Trump Jr., he was told that the Crown Prosecutor of Russia offered to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia as part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump. His response, "If it's what you say, I love it." In other words, the son of a U.S. presidential candidate agreed to accept assistance from a foreign adversary to undermine his father's political opponent. What counterintelligence risks does this set of facts pose? And secondly, what would Russia's intelligence objective be offering such damaging information on a political opponent? And lastly, what other similar techniques used, if at all, were effective, and why might they be effective?
So first, as we've said before, I think it's the ability to get access to the administration. That's where it starts, right? You're talking to people that are around the president or potential president of the United States. From that point on, you have a voice inside that you can filter information to. The second point is that I think Russia looked at this way in advance on how to potentially target these different incoming administrations. In the current president's administration, the people that were around him were not savvy at all, in my opinion, to counterintelligence threats or national security issues. They're coming from the private sector and corporations, and I think they took advantage of that. In a lot of these instances, I don't think the Russians in any way needed to recruit anybody. They needed to be able to get in front of somebody and supply information so that that information then would be conveyed up to the president.
Yeah, I would just add that I think by taking the meeting, and I don't think you need a lot of training for this, by taking the meeting, you've made yourself beholden to Putin in terms of however he wants to characterize it down the road, so that even if nothing inappropriate happens at the meeting, you have that vulnerability as well.
And it tells a great story of how the Russians work. It shows that a prior relationship that the Trumps had basically worked with another prior relationship to reach out directly to Donald Trump Jr. and dangle this potential piece of information. Now, the meeting resulted in nothing, but the fact that they used connections that they knew that Trump had in Moscow through business dealings to basically weave their way to get in front of very, very senior level people in the campaign, Manafort, Trump Jr., and Jared Kushner, shows kind of how they work. They use personal relationships, business relationships, and then they try and piece it together. And like Bob said, I think the one thing that's illustrated is the fact that they were able to access such a high level.
Thank you. One of the topics of discussion at the June 9th meeting were the U.S. sanctions imposed under the Magnitsky Act. How might Russia have leveraged the Trump campaign's acceptance of Russian help to attack Hillary Clinton as an opening to seek access to and influence over Trump and his associates in order to affect U.S. policy regarding sanctions?
I think part of that's more of the same. I think the biggest thing is access. In most of these types of situations, I think the acceleration of access to somebody as high as these people were, as Stephanie just said, doesn't happen as quickly. A lot of what you're seeing here is because, and as I said before, I think people aren't looking at it as a counterintelligence threat or necessarily a national security threat. They're obtaining that. And the reason I'm saying this, Congressman, is because I think that accelerates the process. How this usually works, it takes months to years to get access to individuals that will eventually go up into a level where somebody can relay information. I think one of the biggest things about this, though, is the acceleration of this process because they were able to get so high so quick.
Thank you for your service. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Hey, Chairman. Mr. Anderson, I both appreciated and agreed with your comments during my last round of questioning about the need to update and correct ongoing FISA applications. I want to ask you about the obligations as it relates to exculpatory information. As you know, in the criminal case, we have what's called the Brady Rule, where the government has an obligation upon request to provide any exculpatory information to a defendant that the government may have. Obviously, in a counterintelligence or Title III, it's a different proceeding where a defendant isn't represented. But we know that in this case, the FBI has asserted that the underlying predicate for this counterintelligence investigation was George Papadopoulos in a conversation that he had allegedly with an Australian diplomat. If the FBI had exculpatory information or contradictory information that contradicted that underlying predicate, would you agree with me that the FBI had an obligation not to withhold that and to provide that to the FISA court?
I think the FBI, one, should have vetted both the information as best they could, and then two, I think there should have been a discussion with the DOJ and the FISA court about that information.
And what if there was no discussion with the DOJ about that information? Would that have been improper?
I don't know if it would have been improper, but I don't think that would have been the true transparency that those type of hearings need, especially as I think one of the congressmen brought up earlier. This is a significant power when you're looking at FISA or Title III authority.
Mr. McCarthy, what's your take on that?
You know, in our world, I'm in the same world you were in for a long time, which is criminal investigations. There's some laxity involved in how much you have to disclose with respect to exculpatory information, for example, in the grand jury. But I think the big difference here is that the criminal process has a way of keeping people honest that unfortunately the counterintelligence process doesn't. So even though when you go to get a search warrant or an arrest warrant from a judge in a regular criminal case, you get to go in secret. They're in the sense that they're sealed proceedings and there's no one there representing the defendant. But everybody knows or assumes in the equation that there will eventually be a prosecution, in which case everything will be revealed. The defense is going to get complete discovery of what you represented to the court, and they'll be able to go to work on it. In the FISA process, the only due process an American who is suspected of being an agent of a foreign power ever gets is if the FBI complies with its rules and procedures and the FISA court holds them to it in that proceeding. And I shouldn't confine it just to the FBI, it's the Justice Department as well. To my mind, and I think this is reflective of what most people in that equation think and what the FISA judges seem to think, there's a higher obligation to be transparent, knowing that that process that you get in the criminal thicket, where everybody's going to get discovery of what you did in the court, is not going to happen.
Let me, in my remaining time, ask you, Mr. McCarthy, you've had a number of questions about the need or the desire or whether or not it was appropriate to advise Donald Trump about Russian efforts to interfere in his campaign during a defensive briefing. We know that a defensive briefing took place, was conducted by the FBI on August 17th of 2016.
If I may, I've heard that before. I happen to have been at a meeting at Trump Tower that day, and I know with a bunch of other people. They were going over to get a briefing that candidates get.
Candidate defensive briefing.
Right, but it was not the targeted defensive briefing that they were talking about in this committee's report that Lynch and Comey and McCabe were talking about in the spring of 2016.
Okay, but to my question, earlier you said a reason that at whatever time candidate Trump may not have received a briefing about Russian interference efforts would be if they had already determined that the Steele dossier was true or that he was the subject of a criminal investigation. But we know that that wasn't the case because we know that the FBI director told the President Trump, well into early 2017, that he was not the subject of a criminal investigation, that he was not under investigation. So what reason would the FBI have had in 2016? What legitimate reason would they have had in 2016 not to advise candidate Trump or President-elect Trump about Russian interference threats?
I don't think they had a good reason. I think it would have been preferable if they had done a defensive briefing. I'm familiar with former Director Comey's testimony about this, and I would just point out that he pointed out, I think it was in testimony to this committee, that not everybody on his advisory team agreed with his idea of telling the president or the president-elect that he was not a suspect simply because, in a very technical sense, his name was not on any file and he was not listed as an interceptee on any FISA. And the point that was made to him, which he ultimately rejected, as I understand it, was that the way the investigation was structured, they were looking at the campaign and they were taking evidence about the campaign. And since it was Trump's campaign, obviously he was a subject of what they were looking into. So to tell him that he wasn't a subject seemed like it could be misleading. So I think they should have been more forthcoming with him about his status in the investigation, and I think it would have been preferable if they had done a defensive briefing.
I agree with you, and with that, I yield back.
Ms. Demings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses today. Mr. Anderson, page 10 of the Mueller report notes that the special counsel's office learned that some of the individuals they interviewed or whose conduct they investigated, including some associated with the Trump campaign, deleted relevant communications or communicated using applications that feature encryption or that do not provide for long-term retention of data or communication records. In such cases, the office was unable to corroborate witness statements through comparison to contemporaneous communication or fully question witnesses about statements that appeared inconsistent with other known facts. Given these identified gaps, the office was unable to rule out the possibility that the unavailable information would shed additional light on or cast in a new light the events described in the report, yet the special counsel could not necessarily know if the person on the other side of the communication, likely in a foreign country, might have saved those messages. And coming from a law enforcement background, this is particularly concerning to me. How might a foreign power like Russia leverage knowledge of a U.S. person deleting communications with an agent or other individual working on behalf of the Russian government?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a huge part of our new world we live in. There's numerous different encrypted apps that people use in the private sector. Nowadays, there's hundreds of millions of people that use those apps. I think from a counterintelligence hostile adversary point of view, anytime that information is transmitted to someone that can have access to then deliver it to an intelligence service, there's an issue, because that person is not going to delete the information. That person is going to keep the information and most likely put it into a pool of information where it's correlated and that they can use it. Unfortunately, though, in my career, in the last probably 6 to 7 years between counterintelligence and the executive assistant director, this has become a much bigger issue, because you cannot go back, whether it's a person in a criminal investigation, in a drug case, all the way up to a serious espionage investigation. The last point I'll make, ma'am, is I do think when we look at the safety of our country, when it comes to people in certain political positions, I think that we need to have more standards about what type of communications they can actually use for this matter.
And you talked a little bit about this earlier, but in its heyday, the Soviet KGB collected reams of information on its surveillance targets. Do you believe the KGB's successors, such as FSB or SVR or the GRU, continue these practices?
Yes, and I'll tell you just from my own experience, 30-some years ago when I started in law enforcement, the only way you could find out about somebody was hard footwork, going out, knocking on doors, and actually physically talking to them. Nowadays, with social media and cyber techniques and artificial intelligence is available to not only the open public, but more sophisticated versions of that to hostile intelligence services. They have a pretty good idea of what you like, what you don't like, who you want to hang out with, where you're going to go for coffee, and it just makes them much easier of a target. So I would tell you that the modern day version of what some of us have done 25, 30 years ago provides much more available information to target somebody.
Thank you. And finally, we've discussed the concept of blackmail at several points today. But can you explain how the use of blackmail or leverage, including financial leverage over government officials by foreign powers, can pose a counterintelligence danger? And I believe that should be of importance to all of us in this room.
No, it is very much so. Russia, and there's a few other services that use this extensively, and they'll use either financial blackmail, personal relationship blackmail about potential criminal violations that nobody know about, that they actually know about. As I said earlier in the hearing, the one thing that you will notice with all of these type of progressions, at first it starts off almost non-incidental, asking, tasking, access, phone books, whatever, and it will move through that continuum. The blackmail historically doesn't really start, though, until you say no. Once you say no, depending what they have, they will use any means possible to include destroying your life. They could care less about anybody in this room's life just because we're an American. And they will use those points to target their subjects to get them to do what they want to do.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. I want to ask a few questions of Mr. McCarthy regarding the opening of the counterintelligence investigation and protocols of notifying Congress, protocols that were not followed. We know now that the FBI opened its counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign in July 2016, but they did not brief the Gang of Eight until March 2017, just days before former FBI Director Comey publicly announced the investigation during a March 20th, 2017 open hearing before this committee. So my question to you, Mr. McCarthy, is conveying sensitive information such as the opening of a counterintelligence investigation into a political campaign is exactly what quarterly briefings from the FBI to the Gang of Eight are intended for. Is that correct?
I believe so. I don't see what would be the point of having the Gang of Eight.
I agree with you. Do you think that the FBI director, in this case, Director Comey, should have been allowed to decide when a CI investigation is, quote unquote, too sensitive for the Gang of Eight?
I don't think the FBI director should do that because otherwise you can't have congressional oversight.
I agree with you with that as well. So you would agree when I say that the FBI should not get to pick and choose which investigations, particularly those focused in a U.S. political campaign, are briefed to Congress?
I think that's true, and I think, from what I understand from Director Brennan, he thought that he was obliged to comply with his Gang of Eight disclosure requirements.
Is it appropriate for the FBI, in your opinion, to publicly announce the subject of an ongoing counterintelligence investigation in an open setting before fully briefing Congress on the matter?
No, I don't think the counterintelligence investigations are classified. I don't think the FBI, when it can, should ever confirm the existence of an investigation. Counterintelligence investigations classified, that's like a double no-no, and there's no reason that I can think of to announce publicly the subject of such an investigation, or to say that there be an assessment at the end of crimes being committed.
We know now that Director Comey failed to follow established DOJ procedures during the conduct of this investigation. In your opinion, why do you believe that Director Comey decided to publicly announce the investigation in March 2017 instead of following the protocol and immediately briefing the Gang of Eight during his quarterly briefings?
I know Director Comey for 30 years. I have a lot of respect for him. And I think he goes about, in my experience, he went about his business in good faith. I'm sure if he had a reason, If he did something, he probably thought he had a good reason for it. I don't agree with whatever the reason was, but I can only assess what he did. I can't get into his head.
I want to highlight that I've introduced legislation requiring the briefings to the Gang of Eight, to congressional leadership, when there is an opening of a counterintelligence investigation of a federal campaign. We deserve to know this. It is clear that in this case in 2016, the process and
for not doing East Village, but it's going to be like walking distance from our office whenever it opens downtown. So yeah, sorry.
I knew I had to do that Saturday, but I was like,
Are you covering everybody, or are you just like? Because it seems like I've been talking to like you and Sean and Dave, and like, I mean, I know Dave's a big thing too, but yeah.
Everyone right? Taking a lead on
Yeah.
the candidate.
Yeah.
So like, if there's something that's going to promote it. So
Yeah.
the last few months I've been doing federal network.
Uh-huh.
And like, you know, Matt Kaiser.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm here in support.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
Everybody that's with the march, if we could face this way. We're still in our rows of 5. We're facing this way.
Around the press.
Want a world without war and weapons.
Hey, ma'am. You have a business card? For your business? Thank you.
Sorry.